The coming-of-age story is not often explored in video games, is a lie, but also a truth. It's not explored as much in more conventional ways as part of the Western game space, at least until very recently, or practically never in AAA games outside of side characters. There is one genre that's always been doing it that we'll get to much later. First, I'd like to talk about some short indie games. I won't be diving into deep analysis, this will be a straight recommendation video with less dark illusions, as I've been prone to do in my current emotional state. I just want to share a series of mostly relaxing, relatable adventures with you with minimal criticism. I will talk about gameplay when it's relevant though. Before we begin, I need to explain what it is I'm actually talking about. The coming-of-age story formula always explores growing up, moving on, finding a future, and reflection on the past. These tales tend to be known for dialogue and interpersonal relationships over action set pieces. It's not restricted by age either, just as long as the protagonist grows and comes to a point of understanding with a problem they had at the start of the story. It's just common for these stories to focus on children and teenagers because they have the most growing to do. Now we got that out of the way, let's begin. Developed by Adam Robinson Yu with contributions from 4 other people, A Short Hike is an open-world adventure game where your ultimate goal given at the start of the game is to climb a mountain because it's the only way to get phone reception. But to get there you need help, you need to train. You need to overcome your apparent boredom on this island brimming with life. I mean it, there's so much packed into this tiny game. Races, fishing, secret shortcuts, tons of little quests to complete and stuff added on. It's really strange how little time it takes to finish, considering how much you can and will do, because climbing that mountain won't be easy and will involve a lot of creative problem solving with the platforming. Or you could brute force it and just scour the island and finish every side quest you possibly can. I think the easiest onboarding process for this game is to say it's Animal Crossing mixed with Night in the Woods, but shorter than either of them. There's a certain feel to the dialogue that seems to have become a recurring trend in these types of games, where entire text boxes are dedicated to fractions of sentences in order to convey speech patterns. Something that I don't remember happening before Night in the Woods and do think works remarkably well. In Animal Crossing terms, there's all the little busy work mechanics you can do, the fishing, the shell collecting. There's also the more wholesome air it gives off compared to Night in the Woods' deep dive into mental health and broken relationships. The gameplay is simple, but rich. Of this batch of indie games, it certainly has the most going on in that department. I won't get into all of the options as discovering things on the island is a big feature, so I'll only talk about the golden feathers. These feathers act as a stamina bar, depreciating every time you flap your wings when flying or climbing. These are crucial to get to the top of the mountain, and you'll need to gather a lot of them, because once you reach a certain height, the cold will freeze feathers so they won't replenish without jumping into a nearby hot spring. The simple act of flying around and climbing is a lot of fun, which is already an incentive to keep exploring the island to gather more, on top of the need to reach the top of Hawk's Peak. Of all games I cover in this video, A Short Hike has the least fleshed out characters and story threads, because it doesn't rightly need them. The only core conflict is Claire's hesitance. I forgot to name her. I also forgot to name the mountain until a few seconds ago. I'm sorry, I'm bungling this up, but it's too late now. The only core conflict is Claire's hesitance to be stuck on this island, and just follows a simplification of the hero's journey, which is itself coming of age adjacent. How that journey works out is up to you. White Ocean Big Jacket, developed by Turnfollow, is a small game full of narrative vignettes about 2 kids who are apparently dating, and the cool aunt and uncle who took them on this camping trip. Periodically switching characters to follow a story thread, each personality is conveyed so strongly that the little heads that appear when they talk could have faded away later in the game and you'd still be able to tell who was talking. The way the game is framed is probably the most prominent game mechanic, utilizing the intentionally limited animation to build a specific lo-fi feel to the game. When stationary, you're put in what seems like a first-person perspective and can choose who to talk to. This doesn't change the course of the game and just exists to allow you to exert some control over the story. This was the game that inspired this video. It was such a pleasant time. Though to say the story was bereft of conflict would be untrue. It wasn't all sunshine and daisies on this camping trip, but that's fine. That's exactly what the gears churning in my head about these kinds of stories. Storytelling has come a long way for games in recent years, and avoiding these kinds of stories is a huge missed opportunity. Though AAA games these days that are revered for their storytelling have elements of this genre in it, I can't help but feel a game like White Ocean Big Jacket pulled these off better, by putting you in the shoes of the characters with things to learn, instead of the jaded murder hobo who only develops relative to their younger sidekick. In White Ocean Big Jacket, we delve into these kids' relationships, how close they are, what they're getting out of this small camping trip, and where they'll go beyond what we see. We also explore a smaller snapshot of the aunt and uncle's life, how camping is an integral part of it, and the effect bringing the children had on their relationship. And the whole experience finally edited into this hour-long adventure. There isn't much left to say, since the game is so short. But it's great how much they fit into this small package. You do feel a kinship with these people, all of whom grow from the experience and grow closer in their respective relationships. Exactly what you would want, really. I suppose this needs some disclosure. Being developed in my home city and being a small art community, it's only natural that I'd be acquainted with someone on the Dreamfield team. But regardless, I do know one of the writers. She has supported my comics in the past, and here I have purchased her game. I insist that none of that colours my impressions, but however, I fucking cried at the end of this. Something that has only ever been pulled off by one other game I've ever played. If Found is a visual novel with an interesting approach to moving through its story, primarily by erasing it. I'll get back to that later, but the story follows Cassio, a trans girl returning from college in Dublin to her hometown of Achill, off the coast of Mayo. She hasn't come out to her mother yet, and her brother is a piece of genuine shit, so her homecoming is cut very short. From there, the game develops to Cassio meeting old friends, making new friends, finding a place to belong, and sabotaging herself in despair. Alongside this is a story about a starship pilot named Cassiopeia navigating a black hole. I won't say too much about this, as it mostly exists in later portions of the game. There's multiple ways the story is told in this game, with each section being isolated in chapter select, but you'll spend most time with Cassio's journal, which is covered in ominous scratchings, and you progress through it by erasing everything that's on the page, later warping in a way I believe implies Cassio can erase the words, but not the memories. I played this on the Switch, so you can hold a button to move the eraser, you can use the touchscreen, or use the dedicated Rub Out Everything button. I used that button for a while until it started sabotaging the journal with its wider scope, so just holding the button and doing it manually was more productive. Anyway, the erasing carries over outside the journal to create some incredible transitions that utilize pacing, colour, and often the weather to set up or reflect the moment you're then experiencing. There are times you just have to click through regular visual novel dialogue, which were a nice breather from all the erasing. At the end, a new storytelling mechanic is reduced, and I hate it, so I refuse to talk about it. I think that section was a little too freeform and there's no way to stop it looking like trash when it's all finished. Alright, let's move on. It's also set in the 90s, but the terminology used throughout the game is still in wide use around Ireland today. Terminology that the context and meaning is provided for in these side notes. Being Irish, it ended up being mostly unnecessary for me, but I read them all anyway. If Found is a wonderful little game about queer folk living in the ruralest of Irelands. I would hope you don't need to be so close geographically to understand what that represents. Ignorance is quite prominent on this small island nation, and the story being set over 25 years earlier doesn't change that, I think. We live in an age where people are more openly trans in the media and personal lives, and being a cartoonist, a staggeringly queer profession, I'm surrounded by enough queer folk to know it's still a bubble. I would hope this game pushes the experience and begs more understanding in a way that's difficult to convey with words. As is the point of this video, I want more of these stories to be told, because, despite what some #gamers insist, it is actually easier to relate to a sad trans girl than an angry demon killer. Night in the Woods was developed by Infinite Fall, and I haven't played this game in years. I'm rather scared to go back because of what it represents in my own life, but I think it's an important entry in this genre and clearly influenced the three I just spoke about. It's the story of a girl returning to her hometown after some time away, readjusting and re-establishing herself with the locals, also dealing with her and her friends' mental health problems on the side. On a personal level, this game came out the exact time I was dealing with the same things. With no ambiguity, Night in the Woods was a reflection of my life at the time, just about to leave my life in Canada to return to an Ireland I thought I'd left behind. Aimless and struggling, May's experience resonated too hard with my own to play it so close to it happening. I should acknowledge that If Found follows a similar setup, but the contrast of how May's family reacts to her return, compared to Cassio's, is so different as to change the course of events dramatically. That, and how far it was from the original event in my own life, stopped it hitting as hard as Night in the Woods on a personal level. I returned much later to a simple side-scrolling game where you chat with people, hang out with your friends, and jump around a lot in absurdly simple platforming puzzles that I swear disappeared after the first 10 minutes. There's also rhythm game sequences that I only discovered you can completely skip while gathering footage for this review, and after all that suffering I went through the first time. There are choices to be made in this game that influence endings and relationships. It's not all smooth sailing, with a dark conspiracy weaving its way through the town, and May's friend's self-destructive tendencies play off her own depression and insecurities. But it's a beautiful game and really captures the relatability and struggle through life that an arthouse film coming-of-age story normally captures. I could say more, but my initial playthrough is very far from me now, and if this wonderful art style hasn't immediately sold you, then I don't know what to tell you. I don't even think we can be friends. I've already made the point that modern AAA games rarely explore this storytelling formula, but you can find it quite readily in the indie space. Otherwise, in the Western space, even going back into the past, the only game that actually comes to mind is Spyro the Dragon, even though that was a different time when publishers weren't afraid of putting children and non-humans as playable protagonists. As writing in games improved and things got more adult, the ambition faltered, and I think there's a space for it outside of indies. That all said, the coming-of-age story is doing quite well in Japanese games. Yes, I'm going to talk about some JRPGs again. It's not the only genre that explores it, but it's the only one that does it so frequently in such a mainstream space. We have such strong examples too, from Vivi and Final Fantasy IX, to the entirety of Kingdom Hearts. If you wanted some pure, unfiltered coming-of-age story by definition JRPGs, I could go wild and talk about Earthbound or Mother 3, but unfortunately I haven't finished them, so I'm going to talk about some very recent examples, both of which I just happened to finish in recent months, that I also think are some of the absolute best in regards to the topic, especially if you want a relaxing time. These are of course much longer games with a lot more mechanics, so I'll be taking a lot more time to talk about them compared to earlier in this video. Hold on a second. I know I've been saying this wrong, so I'm going to
How would you go about pronouncing this in French originally? Atelier. Atelier. But in English or American, this would be said atelier. Atelier.
Really?
This word is pronounced as atelier. Atelier.
Come on now. Alright then. The Atelier series is developed by Dusk, and Atelier Ryza is the current status quo for the series. The 9 that came before it follow a similar beat with gradual quality of life improvements, but Ryza stepped out of that mold and in the process became the first to feature the same lead protagonist more than once. Gameplay changes notwithstanding, they're all about a young girl learning about alchemy and maturing emotionally over the course of the game. The stakes tend to be a lot lower than your standard JRPG fare, since these games are planned in trilogies and you can't drastically alter the world state by killing the same god 3 times in a row. One of the things people know the Atelier series for is time limits, which is pretty strange now that it's been phased out completely. It was a core mechanic back in the Ireland series, but it gradually vanished over the course of the Dusk series, and by the time Ryza rolls around 7 games later, they'll no longer even count the days. Though they do address the passing of time. Sometimes to progress the story you just have to wait a certain amount of time to pass, which isn't as aimless as it sounds. Synthesizing a single item causes a day to pass in the game world, so time passes by pretty instantly. Anyway, just wanted to highlight that in case anyone asked. Don't want to add stress to this relaxing experience. God, I haven't started talking about the game yet. Atelier Ryza, Ever Darkness and the Secret Hideout is about Rysalind Stout, a girl with famous thighs, a family farm, and an insatiable thirst for adventure. Something it seems pretty easy to have when you live on a secluded island where the nearest body of land is swarming with monsters, ruins, and secrets the church is trying to hide. When some new people show up in the village, Ryza promptly makes friends with all of them, and they lead her, but in a lot of cases, she leads them, on a summer adventure. She learns about alchemy in the process from one of these visitors, and the majority of the game is spent helping villagers with their problems utilizing that alchemy. A lot of the game exudes this carefree attitude where Ryza comes into her own as an alchemist. After previously being known as an unruly child, she grows to help and even save the island she grew up on from whatever impending threat falls upon it. If there's anything that stomps on this carefree attitude, it's the absurd difficulty curve. The game uses a unique combat system that took a lot of getting used to, but even then, the lack of it being turn-based added a layer of difficulty that makes the game so laborious it could only be offset by swapping to easy mode. There's just nothing in this game that feels like it should be that punishing. It's like if Animal Crossing had a time limit on its loans, and if you didn't pay them off, the Knucklings would break into your house and take stuff out of your storage. Okay, that's a strange analogy, but it's a great way to stop people playing Animal Crossing, isn't it? That's what the difficulty spikes in Ryza feel like. Combat system in question is, as mentioned, not turn-based, but it's incredibly similar. The problem is time doesn't stop during turns, and you can be attacked while skill animations are playing out, outright cancelling them often. You can't do the same for the enemy, but there is a different system in place there. When an enemy begins to charge a move, you need to work to reduce this gauge here to 0 to stop the attack and stun the enemy temporarily. Skills cost AP that you can only build up by attacking, and when you max the AP gauge, you can upgrade your attack patterns overall. Achieving this is the most important part of every battle. When you have 10 or more AP and your turn is still rolling around, you can activate a quick action to attack immediately with skills or items. If you activate when your party members are ready, they'll use whatever they have prepared alongside you. Items, on the other hand, need to be equipped, and to use them up takes CC points. Honestly, I found items pretty useless overall, with the extreme limit and generally small benefits provided. When you get a dedicated healer in your party, it's just easier to switch to them and take the time to use their skills. Oh yeah, you can swap party members at will, as any good JRPG that requires you only control one party member at a time while the others auto-attack. Yeah, I think it's a really messy system that could easily be cleaned up by some time freezing on your turn, and the item system is clearly in place, so you don't have to spend a lot of time synthesizing to fill your inventory. But at least allow the option to increase uses over the course of the game, or better yet, reset the uses per battle. I do expect to go into Ryza 2 with some changes in place for the battle system, but right now I don't know what. So for now, playing on easy is the only solution to dealing with this messy system. The alchemy system is simple. Probably too simple to go in depth on. You match the appropriate materials at the appropriate levels to make items. Each recipe has a tree, and if there's a note beside the listing, you can discover a new recipe while synthesizing. Occasionally, when dealing with requests, you're asked to make items with a certain quality level, or a certain trait. And fulfilling that criteria is really as simple as using higher level materials, or just enough materials in the right slot on the recipe tree. The process is quick, it passes a day in the game world and is consistently beneficial to your progression. At the end of the game you're tasked with making some important item and reiterating on it, and I spent enough time unlocking recipes and just naturally picking up materials while grinding levels that I was able to synthesize it easily. Makes the work I put in feel satisfying and ultimately rounds out Ryza's arc perfectly. When I started this game, the combat felt like beating my head against a wall. They hadn't added extra difficulties at that point, but I kept playing because I would just wander around town to find materials, and small stories unfolded across the island. Ryza has a bit of a problem with its presentation, as occasionally when you deal with story segments, the cutscenes leave no indication of what to do next. There are points marked on the map to go to when specific locations are required, and I later discovered that checking journal updates in the quest menu would tell you exactly what was needed to be done, which was very odd, but it seemed a deliberate choice as a lot of the stories I stumbled into weren't part of the main story, just little vignettes about your friends and inhabitants. I believe it's supposed to encourage exploration, which works towards the start when the world is so confined, but the game is rich in quality of life features so you can just fast travel at will to all locations and bypass these segments. I regret not spending more time wandering around the island in the latter portion of the game, but the whole experience had become insanely streamlined at that point. It was hard to not just ride on by. Atelier Ryza, Ever Darkness and the Secret Hideout is a strange game. It has a lot of age-old JRPG problems, while it also tries to teach the genre new lessons. I haven't played enough of Gust's games to get a good read on them yet, but Ryza was good enough to give them another shot after the borefest that was Knights of Azure. That said, despite my dislike of the combat system, I did enjoy Ryza and her cohort's adventures, their relationships with their creepy looking mentors, the struggle to convince the locals that the church's opinions on alchemy are ridiculous, the plight with the local bully that takes up a huge portion of the game, and the discovery of a quaint abandoned house in the woods they converted into a secret hideout to add some weird gameplay features. It was a small adventure with some low stakes. I have no idea where they could go after it with Ryza 2, but I look forward to another chill adventure with an older cast, new characters, an advancement of their coming of age rituals with a fish out of water story most likely, and hopefully an improved battle system. Trails of Cold Steel is a bit complicated. Developed by Nihon Falcom, it is technically the sixth game in a series set in a consistent world, beginning with the Trails in the Sky trilogy, and an unreleased in English duology known as the Crossbell arc, both of which feature different casts, and Cold Steel is no different. Being set in the same world, just months after the Crossbell arc, you do get occasional references to the events from previous games, and on rare occasions old characters show up. You don't need to have played any of the old games though, as I've only beat the first chapter in Trails in the Sky before this, and I don't really feel I lost out on context that wasn't provided to me. You see, I think the real strength of this series is that it's the first time I've played a game that felt like part of a huge epic fantasy series that relies more on its characters to tell a story with the established universe, not just to support them, but exist outside of them. As a side, I'm well aware I'm making this argument in a medium where one of the most popular games of the last 10 years was an unambiguous sequel to a series of Polish fantasy novels from the 90s that weren't fully available in English until 3 years after the final game's release. So you know what? Fuck context. So in the land of Erebonia, currently tensions are rising between the noble families and a faction set to reform the society and remove its caste system. A conflict which doesn't take center stage until the second game. For now, you play as Reen Schwarzer and live through his first year at Thor's military academy. The entire game takes place over the course of a single Japanese school year, even with all the German influence. This probably sounds familiar to a seasoned Persona player, and yes, this game does actually adopt the Persona format in many ways, but it rigorously pushes the game into a routine. And being a JRPG, your party ends up being all of your classmates. So here's the conceit. You play through a school year as Reen, in a special class that frequently goes on field studies, getting to know new people and experiencing other parts of the Empire of Erebonia. Not only is this game in a genre that contains a lot of coming of age stories, but the school he goes to put him in a class carefully constructed for every child within to explicitly experience all their own coming of age rituals as part of their school curriculum. 90% of the game is character development, and that's fantastic. The routine you follow through the game, I'm going to get the order wrong, but that's not important. You have the field studies, where you head out to a different part of the Empire. You're given some main and optional quests to complete, which always involve wandering around the town you're staying and trawling through a dungeon to fight a boss. These journeys take several days of game time. You have the free roam sections in school, where you can hang out with the classmates the same way you would do social links or confidants in Persona. And go fishing. You're given main and side quests to complete during these sections too, and when you're finished you have to explore the old schoolhouse, a dungeon that adds a new floor every month until the end of the game. The last and smallest part of the game is the practical exam. Each practical exam is a boss battle with a set matchup. I'm not entirely sure how necessary they were, but they did always play into the established character dynamics, even if they didn't advance them. The gameplay is standard turn-based JRPG combat, but with the ability to spend a turn to move around the field. The biggest difference between this and previous Trails games is the ability to link to other party members and activate various skills and combos through them. The Persona-style relationship building is primarily to boost these functions, although sometimes you get worthwhile story content from just hanging with the person you want, even if there's no actual benefit. The thing from older games that has remained the same is the CP bar. You gain these points from attacking or being attacked, and a few other ways, but you can use them for character-specific skills or ideally their ultimate move. The best way to deal with bosses is to have everyone's bar charged to 200 and just unleash hell on the first round of battle. While you put a massive dent in their HP bar, the game does seem to account for this and bosses tend to be pretty difficult. Luckily, the game doesn't immediately game over and throw you back to your last save, but offers you an immediate retry, or if something doesn't seem like it can be overcome, the ability to fight a weaker version of enemies. I did start using this function well past the halfway point, as some bosses were completely ridiculous, but it's a good way to deal with a classic problem that isn't just grinding levels for another hour. I've always found the turn-based JRPG loop relaxing. Hell, that's a key component of Dragon Quest's success, as mentioned in my Dragon Quest XI review. There are other minigame-like features that pop up throughout the game, some of them one-off moments, and the other is fishing. Well, there's actually a lot to dive into here. Cooking mechanics, side quests, a card game you can play on the train when traveling to field study locations, Books to read that boost relationships, recap events, or just expand the world. A lot of things tend to do that though. Trails of Cold Steel is a huge game that took me a long time to get through. Even though its rigorously paced story felt like it went by pretty quickly. The whole purpose of this first game, of the now available 4, is to endear you to these characters and their plight. There aren't many JRPGs that do a good job convincing you why the party should put their lives on the line for one another. But that's entirely what this game is about. They go through their respective coming of age rituals, but they do it together, all the way up to the last minute. I know this story isn't over yet and my plan to hold off on the second game for a while came crashing down when the sequel hook changed just about everything. There's a lot of reasons to recommend this low budget, high ambition adventure, but the journey you go on with these characters is just hard to find in any other game, and I'm proud to bookend these recommendations with it. Alright, how do I end this? I actually want to mention that 3 of these games on this list were in the colossal bundle for racial justice that about 1 million people bought on itch in 2020. So if you're one of those people, you already have those games. On another note, I just played way too many games focused on plagues last year, and I have a hard time starting new ones right now that assault the senses in an uncomfortably real way. JRPGs were an accidental escape from that. I'd just planned to finish one a month for this entire year, and being incredibly long games just leaves smaller games to think about outside of that. Or Monster Hunter. I'm rambling on a bit here, but I guess I'm trying to say I'm exhausted, as I'm sure we all are really, and these games were a nice escape.